Long before the hairstyles, the trophies, or the headlines, there was a little boy in Santos who played football for one simple reason. Seeing his family smile meant more than scoring goals. Years later, millions would call him a genius. Millions of others would call him a disappointment. How can the same player become both? To understand Neymar, we have to go back to the only time when football wasn't about fame, money, or pressure. Back to the boy from Santos. Because sometimes the greatest football stories are not about the goals that were scored, but about the invisible weight carried by the person who scored them. And perhaps no player of the modern era carried a heavier burden than Neymar. Picture the deafening roar of a packed stadium. Now picture a child, thousands of miles away, mimicking a step-over on a dirt road. Look at the timeline of any social media feed, fractured down the middle. Half the world defending a magician, the other half condemning a villain. See the tears of absolute heartbreak on a World Cup pitch, followed by the thunderous applause of a Champions League night. Very few human beings in the modern history of sports have provoked such violent, opposing emotions. We demand perfection from our heroes, yet we punish them when they remind us they are human. So, who is the real Neymar? Is he the untouchable global superstar? The misunderstood artist? Or is he simply a kid who never asked to carry the psychological weight of an entire nation? Before the brand existed, before the controversies, and the record-breaking contracts, there was only a boy. A boy trying to convince his family that tomorrow could be better than today. Every generation searches for someone to believe in. Brazil believed it had found its next immortal. But the higher the expectations rise, the more painful every human flaw becomes. In the quiet, working-class neighborhoods of coastal Brazil, childhood often moves at a different pace. But for Neymar da Silva Santos Jr., the luxury of an ordinary youth was never truly an option. His father, a former professional footballer who never quite reached the summit, knew the harsh realities of the game. The family understood what it meant to struggle, to count coins, to wonder what the next month would bring. For them, a football wasn't just a toy. It was a lifeline. It was survival. While other children played purely for the thrill of the afternoon sun, young Neymar played with an invisible gravity attached to his feet. He possessed a supernatural gift, a rhythm that could not be taught. No coach can teach imagination. No academy can manufacture instinct. Some players learn football. Others seem to remember it from the moment they first touched the ball. But with that gift came an unspoken responsibility. He wasn't just playing for himself. He was playing for the roof over their heads. He was the vessel for his family's salvation. Long before he became responsible for the hopes of millions, he had already become responsible for the hopes inside a single house. Sometimes history begins not inside a stadium, but around a family dinner table. It is a terrifying burden to place on a child, yet he carried it with a blinding, infectious smile. Yet children rarely understand pressure. They simply keep playing. Perhaps that innocence was the greatest gift Neymar would ever lose. He danced through defenders on futsal courts, his fragile frame absorbing tackles from boys twice his size. But as his name began to whisper through the local scouting networks, a pivotal choice loomed on the horizon, a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life and the landscape of Brazilian football forever. Santos Football Club is not just a team. It is a mythic institution. It is the house that Pelé built, a place where the grass is practically woven with the memory of footballing royalty. For decades, Brazil had been waiting for a spark to reignite that sacred ground. When Neymar stepped onto the pitch for the senior team, he didn't just play. He resurrected a ghost. He brought back the soulful, rhythmic swagger that once made Brazilian football the envy of the earth. Suddenly, adults were smiling like children again. Football in Brazil has always been more than a sport. It is memory, identity, escape. And for a brief moment, Watching Neymar felt like remembering something the country thought it had forgotten forever. Grandfathers who had watched the legends of the 60s wept in the stands, recognizing a familiar magic. Every match felt less like a competition and more like a carnival. Opponents came to stop him. Spectators came to witness him. Somewhere along the way, football itself became secondary to the possibility of seeing something that had never happened before. According to widespread reports, the wealthiest clubs in Europe arrived with open checkbooks while he was still a teenager, desperate to pull him across the Atlantic. But he stayed, and by staying, he did the impossible. He turned the Brazilian domestic league into global appointment viewing. For the first time in years, millions of people outside Brazil were waking up early or staying awake late just to watch a teenager play football. Not because they supported Santos, but because they feared missing something unforgettable. Yet, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. The more he dazzled, the higher the pedestal grew. Brazil had found its new savior. The problem with becoming a nation's savior is that people stop allowing you to fail. Every mistake becomes betrayal. Every defeat becomes personal. Now, the question was whether the rest of the world would bow to the same king. What followed was a national explosion unlike anything seen in the modern era. Neymar didn't just win matches. He humiliated opponents with a joyful, almost arrogant artistry. He brought Santos back to the pinnacle of South America, lifting the Copa Libertadores and cementing his status as a living legend before his 21st birthday. His face was everywhere. Success arrived so quickly that very few people stopped to ask whether the young man behind the smile was growing at the same pace as the myth being built around him. He transcended the sport, becoming a pop culture phenomenon, a fashion icon, a symbol of youth and rebellion. But a subtle, dangerous shift was taking place. The more the public adored him, the less they allowed him to be human. The joy that defined his game was suddenly scrutinized. His flair was called disrespect. His youth was labeled immaturity. The critics sharpened their knives, demanding European discipline from a boy whose entire identity was built on South American freedom. The same dribbles that once made people smile suddenly became evidence of arrogance. Nothing about Neymar had changed. Only the expectations around him had. The pressure was no longer just about winning. It was about behaving exactly how the world dictated. Crossing the ocean was no longer just a career progression. It was an inevitability. But leaving Brazil meant abandoning the only sanctuary where he was still allowed to be the boy from Santos. Crossing the Atlantic has changed the destiny of countless Brazilian footballers. But for Neymar, it would also change the way the world chose to see him. Arriving in Catalonia, he walked into a dressing room of gods. Barcelona was already a masterpiece, and Lionel Messi was its undisputed architect. Soon, Luis Suarez arrived, and one of the most terrifying, telepathic attacking lines in the history of the sport was born. They conquered Europe. They won the Champions League. They painted moments of collective brilliance that will be replayed for centuries. For many supporters, watching that Barcelona side felt less like watching a football match and more like watching artists improvise on the world's biggest stage. But beneath the celebrations, a silent, complex conflict was brewing. How does a generational genius forge his own absolute identity when he is sharing the stage with the greatest player to ever touch a football? Neymar was beloved in Barcelona, but he was a prince in a kingdom that already had a king. History rarely remembers the second brightest star in the sky. Perhaps Neymar's greatest challenge was never learning to play beside Messi. It was learning to exist beside him. Every artist harbors a deep, primal desire to author their own masterpiece, not just contribute to someone else's. This quiet tension haunted his final days in Spain. He was faced with a choice between the comfort of guaranteed greatness alongside friends and the terrifying risk of stepping out entirely on his own. Comfort has never built legends, but neither has every risk led to greatness. Neymar was about to discover how thin that line could be. A single signature on a piece of paper was about to shatter the financial foundations of the sport. When Paris Saint-Germain triggered his release clause, making him the most expensive player in human history, the narrative fractured. The astronomical price tag stripped away his humanity in the eyes of the public. He was no longer viewed as a man playing a game. He was a corporate asset, an investment that demanded immediate, flawless returns. The expectations in Paris were not just high. They were impossible because the transfer fee no longer belonged to football. It belonged to imagination. Every supporter expected history every single weekend. Every time he stepped onto the pitch, nothing less than perfection was acceptable. When his body betrayed him, and injuries sidelined him during crucial Champions League nights, the headlines were merciless. Every defeat was framed as a personal moral failure. Every absence was treated as a betrayal. The world had stopped asking whether Neymar was happy. It only asked whether he was delivering enough. Somewhere between the headlines and the expectations, the person slowly disappeared behind the symbol. The joy that once fueled his every movement was slowly being suffocated by the crushing weight of a price tag. Football had always been his language, but now every touch of the ball was being translated into headlines, debates, and impossible expectations. He was delivering extraordinary numbers, producing moments of breathtaking skill. Yet the world seemed determined to focus only on what he hadn't won. But no matter how heavy the skies over Paris became, they could not compare to the gravity of returning home. To wear the number 10 shirt for the Brazilian national team is to wear a garment woven from ghosts. It is not a jersey. It is a heavy, suffocating armor. When you put it on, you are not just playing against the opposition. You are playing against Pelé. You are measured against Zico, Romario, Ronaldo, and Ronaldinho. Every 4 years, the World Cup arrived, and an entire nation of over 200 million people placed their collective happiness squarely on Neymar's shoulders. For millions of Brazilians, winning the World Cup was no longer just a sporting ambition. It had become a way of reconnecting with memories, identity, and national pride. Neymar became the face of that impossible longing. Every elimination felt like a national mourning, and the blame inevitably sought out the brightest star. Nations often search for heroes when they are really searching for hope, and hope has a cruel habit of blaming the person who carried it when reality refuses to follow the dream. In those moments of crushing defeat, curled on the grass in tears, the world finally saw the vulnerability he had tried so hard to hide. We demand our icons to be invincible, forgetting that the armor is worn by a fragile human being. Perhaps no one, no matter how gifted, is truly engineered to carry the psychological hopes of an entire country without breaking. Every generation chooses one player to carry dreams that were never meant to be carried by a single human being. Neymar simply happened to be born at the exact moment Brazil needed someone to believe in again. History often celebrates heroes without asking what it cost them to become one. And perhaps that is exactly why his true value can never be found in a trophy cabinet. Step away from the statistics. Ignore the endless debates on television panels. Look, instead, at the schoolyards in Tokyo, the dusty pitches in Nairobi, the concrete courts in London, and the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. Millions of children are stepping over the ball, trying to replicate his exact rhythm. They wear his hairstyles. They try to capture his irreverent smile. They play with a sense of daring that he gave them permission to feel. His influence bleeds far beyond the boundaries of a stadium. Entire generations discovered that football could still be playful, unpredictable, and joyful. In an increasingly tactical sport, Neymar reminded the world that imagination still had a place on the pitch. Greatness is rarely just a mathematical equation of medals and cups. Some players change scoreboards. Others change generations. Neymar somehow managed to change the imagination of millions. True greatness is measured by how many people decided to fall in love with the game because they watched you play. Statistics grow old. Records are broken. But inspiration travels quietly from one generation to the next, often without anyone noticing. Regardless of the controversies, the critics, or the unfulfilled prophecies, his cultural footprint is permanent. He reminded a rigid, tactical era of football that the game is, at its core, supposed to be fun. The story of the boy from Santos was never strictly about conquering the world. It was about inspiring the world to dream. Look back at that dirt road. Look at the barefoot kid with the ball glued to his feet, playing until the streetlights flicker on. Fame changed his address, but perhaps it never changed the little boy who celebrated every goal with the same childlike happiness that first made people fall in love with him. Money changed his reality, but somewhere beneath the contracts, the trophies, and the cameras, the child who once played simply to hear his family laugh never completely disappeared. The world demanded he become a machine, a savior, a villain, and a monument. Yet the most unforgettable moments of his career happened precisely when he forgot the pressure and played with the spontaneity of the child he once was. But deep down, it never truly changed the essence of why he played. One day, the relentless machine of football will move on. New prodigies will emerge. New transfer records will be shattered. But years from now, in some quiet corner of Brazil, another little boy will drop his shoulder, smile at a defender, and try to recreate a piece of magic he once saw Neymar do. And maybe that is a form of eternity that no gold medal can ever quantify. Perhaps football was never meant to create perfect heroes. Perhaps it was meant to create stories that remind us how extraordinary imperfect human beings can be. Because some legends are remembered for the trophies they collected, others are remembered for making millions of people feel alive. Perhaps the world spent so much time arguing about what Neymar should have become that it forgot to appreciate what he already was. A boy who played with joy in an era obsessed with efficiency. A dreamer in a sport that increasingly demanded perfection. And maybe that contradiction is exactly what made him unforgettable. Because before he became a superstar, a symbol, or a controversy, he was simply a boy from Santos who believed football was supposed to make people smile. And maybe that is why his story continues to divide people. Because we never argued about Neymar's talent. We argued about the impossible expectations we placed upon a child who simply never stopped playing football with the joy of the boy he once was. And maybe, years from now, history will remember Neymar not only for the goals he scored, but for the smiles he inspired in millions of children who picked up a ball believing football could still be beautiful. Perhaps that is why Neymar's story will never truly end. Every generation will see him differently, and every generation will ask the same question: what could have been, and what was already extraordinary? When you hear the name Neymar, what is the very first image that comes to your mind? The fearless boy from Santos, the magician who dazzled Barcelona, or the man who carried Brazil's impossible expectations? Share your answer in the comments and tell us which football story should become our next documentary. The fearless boy from Santos, the magician who dazzled Barcelona, or the man who carried Brazil's impossible expectations? Share your answer in the comments and tell us which football story should become our next documentary.